Good evening. It's April 3rd, 2015. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to welcome all of you to our weekly webcast with LaRouchepack.com. This is a very unique and important broadcast that we're hosting here tonight. I'm joined in the studio by our feature guest this evening, Benjamin Deniston from the LaRouche Pack Basement Team. We're also joined by Jeffrey Steinberg from Executive Intelligence Review. Just by means of introduction, Ben will be presenting a summary presentation tonight based off of research that is included in a new paper that has been published this week by Benjamin Deniston called Memo for the Next President, New Perspectives on the Western Water Crisis. This is included as the feature item in this week's Executive Intelligence Review magazine, which is titled The Mission of the Presidency. And those of you who are viewers of this website regularly will maybe have seen the presentation that Ben Deniston did this past Wednesday on the Basement Team's New Paradigm for Mankind show. So what Benjamin Deniston will go through tonight is supplemented by this paper, which is available on LaRouchepack.com also, and we highly encourage you to study this and to read this, and by all means circulate what is about to occur tonight as widely as you possibly can. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Benjamin Deniston.
Thanks, Matthew. People know California is in a major water crisis. This is not news. It was just announced this past week, though, that for the first time in the state's history, an acting governor has instituted mandatory restrictions on water use as an emergency measure. Now, this is, I would say, really tragedy. It's more of the same. It's more of the same failed policies that have already brought California to its current point of crisis and potential threat. And now it's time to get serious about the water crisis in California and elsewhere more generally. The fact of the matter is, right now, at this point, in the conditions in the United States, but also more broadly, I'm going to focus on the western regions of the United States, we can no longer simply rely on managing local or regional water supplies. That the situation in California expresses more clearly than anything else that we've gone past that. We've gone beyond the point where we can just manage existing local or regional water cycles. There are no solutions in the current bickering that's going on about who's going to get what limited water there is. In California, you have fights between the North and the South. Who gets the water? Fights between the farmers and the cities. Who gets the water? It's all insane at this point. And the additional plan in this crisis now to simply cut use and impose mandatory restrictions without providing any actual solutions, and I mean solutions by increasing the water supply, the water cycle to California and other regions. Without that, what's being proposed right now is a plan that's going to result in depopulation and the death of the state of California. There is no guarantee that this drought that's going on now is going to stop. And I'm going to get into this, but by the historical records, it's actually more likely that this type of process is going to continue. And the Brown plan for the state of California is for a brown state with no life. So the point is, we need solutions. We need a new perspective and a new approach to this crisis. And we need to approach the issue of water in California and water more generally at a higher level. Now, I'm going to reference what China is doing, because this is the right perspective. This is the right direction, what we're seeing coming out of China right now. The perspective being developed and pursued by the BRICS nations. And Mr. LaRouche has emphasized very strongly that this means, most emphatically, China's space program, their lunar program, the mission to elevate mankind to a solar system perspective and beyond, to understand the world's water system from this higher standpoint. And from some discussions with Mr. LaRouche earlier today, based upon the work I presented in this paper that Matthew just referenced, this means today most emphatically going to the highest level, which is a galactic perspective with galactic metrics and a galactic clock, as Mr. LaRouche was saying earlier today. So that's the subject that we're going to get into here. So first of all, just to lay the proper groundwork for this discussion, this is not a new crisis. This is not a surprise. The North American Water and Power Alliance, a project designed to bring a small fraction of the abundant fresh water of the Northwest, Alaska, British Columbia, the Yukon Territory, down into the Southwest, was a program that was designed in the 1950s and 1960s for exactly this reason. It was known that the natural water conditions of the Southwest were not going to be adequate to sustain the population and sustain growth in the western regions of the United States. It was known then, over 50 years ago, that the future of the Southwest depended upon bringing new water supplies to that region. Since then, Mr. LaRouche has been on this issue for decades. We see in the first graphic, the first indication here, you can see as early as in 1982, Mr. LaRouche drafted a document entitled, "Won't you please let your grandchildren have a drink of fresh water?" Now, this was a document that Mr. LaRouche wrote that featured prominently the NWAPA project. And again, this was 1982. So do the math now, over 30 years ago. The grandchildren that Mr. LaRouche was speaking of over 3 decades ago, warning of the crisis that's now hitting, have been born. Where is their water? The point is, nothing has been done, despite the fact that these crises have been known, despite the fact that it was so well understood that the West was going to need these new water supplies. This entire NWAPA system was designed and proposed decades ago. So the crisis we're facing here, now, today, in California, maybe being the most extreme current expression, but it's not just limited to California. This crisis is here today because of this failure to act over the past 2 generations. Now contrast this with what's happened in China, what's going on in China. If we see in the second graphic, here we see a comparison of what China has done in the recent period in terms of water diversion projects with what the United States has done over the past century. Now, as illustrated in the timeline depicted beneath the United States, you can see clearly that from the time of Franklin Roosevelt in the early 1930s up through the time of John F. Kennedy, you had a remarkable growth and expansion of water development projects in the United States. For the West, this included the management of the Colorado River, the Sacramento River, and the San Joaquin River. This development created a series of systems which had the capacity to deliver about 20 cubic kilometers per year of fresh water throughout California and other regions in the Southwest from the 5 projects depicted here. But you can see clearly that since the 1970s, after this period of progress from Roosevelt to Kennedy, the United States has done nothing. The United States failed to act on NWAPA, failed to follow LaRouche's warnings and advice, and failed to follow the warnings of others, declaring and defining the fact that the Southwest, the survival of the Southwest, depended upon these types of projects, bringing new water to the region. Then look at China. In less than 2 decades, China has surpassed what the United States had done. What we see here is a depiction of their South Water North project, which already, not even being fully completed, already has a greater capacity than the combined 5 projects of the Southwest United States. Between their eastern and central routes, a total of about 27 cubic kilometers of fresh water per year is being delivered, compared with the 20 of the entire Southwest system. And they currently have designs and studies ongoing to develop a western route, which, once that's developed and implemented, the total of China's entire South Water North project will become over twice what the United States has done in their southwest region. So again, they've already surpassed us, but in about 15 years, they've done more than what the United States did in 40 years. Now, a keystone, for further comparison, a keystone of China's water development project is their Three Gorges Dam. Now again, this surpasses what the United States had done earlier. The Three Gorges Dam has a greater storage capacity than either the Hoover Dam or the Grand Coulee, two of the kind of highlight projects of this period of growth under Franklin Roosevelt. And the Three Gorges has a greater power generation capability than both of those U.S. dams combined. And in fact, the Three Gorges Dam is currently the single largest power generation facility in the entire world, stationed on the Yangtze River as part of this whole Chinese water management program. So what we see here in this comparison, it's clearly illustrated. China is showing us that these things can be done. That while the United States has degenerated, China has progressed and progressed more quickly. So now California is suffering and dying from the effects of this degeneration of the United States. And we could probably most aptly call this the brown degeneration. And quite frankly, the situation is still probably worse than most people will let themselves believe. Now, I want to really emphasize some recent studies that have been done looking at the history of the climate in the western United States and in California. And what's been uncovered in these studies is indications showing that the climate in California over the past 100 years to 150 years is actually an anomaly compared to the records going back a few thousand years. That the past century, century and a half has actually been wetter with a greater supply of water than the region would normally expect on average. It's actually been more stable than this longer period of thousands of years, where normally you would expect dramatic fluctuations, things even referred to as mega droughts, lasting decades or longer, or on the flip side, even mega floods, which dump huge amounts of water, potentially flooding the entire Central Valley of California, which has happened before. So the climate in the West has been characterized over a longer period, according to these studies, by greater variation and overall averaging of drier conditions. So if you recognize that and let that sink in, quite frankly, it might not even be accurate to call the current situation in California a drought. It might be more of moving out of an anomalously wet period and into what naturally is a drier climate in California and the West. So that's the reality that we're facing. And that's the reality we have to overcome, despite the insane ideas of Governor Brown and others that we're just going to pray for rain, tell people to stop showering and stop watering their lawns, and hope the situation gets better while the state dies off. Now, if we'd built NWAPA in the 1960s, we'd obviously be in a better position to deal with this. But that was over 50 years ago, and now we've gone beyond that because of this failure to act. It is impossible right now to just throw old solutions at a currently worse situation. We have to go farther. And not just in a larger scale, but what I want to get across here tonight is to a higher cognitive understanding of what our global water system actually is and how we can begin to manage it better from this higher standpoint. NWAPA was going to a larger scale. And, it's likely that we might still need something like that in the longer term to deal with certain aspects of the conditions. But that has to be subsumed by going to a higher level, not just a larger scale. Now I want to pull up the next graphic here, the third graphic, to get at this. This is a very simplified illustration of the global water cycle. Contrary to the belief of many foolish greenies and environmentalists, water is not something you use up. It's an inherent cycle. It's a cyclical system that mankind taps into, improves, and develops, and utilizes his control over this cycle to improve the biosphere, improve the land. This is what mankind has historically always done and what mankind must continue to do. Now, the basic characteristics of this cycle is evaporation of ocean water, putting that water into the atmosphere, and then the precipitation of of evaporated water, atmospheric moisture, over land, where it can participate in terrestrial cycles, in economic activity, in biological activity, in plant life. It can do something productive, something useful for the terrestrial biosphere. And then it cycles back into the ocean again. It doesn't disappear. It's not used up. It's a cyclical system. Now, up to this point, the vast majority of water management is limited to a single category of activity, a single type of activity, which is managing the water that has already fallen on land. Now, whether this is groundwater or snowpack melting to create river flows, this is all precipitated water that's fallen out of the atmosphere onto land. And these can be local irrigation projects, larger regional projects like the United States built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, which we were just looking at. Or they can be even larger projects, continental projects like NWAPA. But all of those together are still a single category of activity, a single type of activity. Mankind relating to this cycle at a particular level, which is managing this precipitated water, surface water, groundwater. Given the current crisis, we have to go further. Again, not just to a larger scale, but to a higher level. We can't just rely on the natural results of these water cycles. We have to look for new ways to control the cycles themselves. If needed, expand the cycles themselves. And if that's not enough, create our own cycles anew. Now, the beginning of this new stage is probably the most important step, is recognizing that this is not an Earth-based process. That the water cycle on Earth is not a reflection of the Earth in and of itself. All kinds of terrestrial factors play a role. Ocean cycles, volcanic activity, these are all factors affecting the global water cycle. But ultimately, the whole thing is driven by cosmic factors. We have to look at this from outside the Earth. People seem to forget the sun powers the entire global water cycle. All the evaporation, which is the basis of all water on land, as far as we know, is provided by the activity of the sun. That drives the entire process. So this raises one immediate question: what happens when the sun changes? If we go to the next graphic, we can get one indication of the type of activity that we have records of. Now, this is a selection of sites where we have records showing particularly climate variations, and for the most part, variations in water availability, the water cycle, in different parts of the world. And these are variations that correspond directly with changes in solar activity. And on these studies in particular, you're looking at scales of a few hundred years in terms of the lengths of these cycles. That when the sun goes into periods of weakening, of weaker activity, less sunspots, less magnetic activity, less flaring activity, when the sun gets weaker generally, which it does periodically, which we know of already, you tend to get these types of fluctuations, changes in the climate patterns, in the water availability. In particular, what we saw there in the mid-latitude regions, including California, where we have all these yellow, orangish yellow circles indicating, you tend to get drier periods when the sun gets weaker. Up in the north, you get indications where it gets colder. You get colder climate conditions in these weaker periods of solar activity. More in the direct line of the tropics, in some regions you tend to actually get wetter activity. So the climate changes. And this might be a surprise to the IPCC. We might want to send them a letter so they realize that the climate changes without mankind's activity. That this whole British genocide lobby, this idea that man is the main driving force in all these climate changes, is completely ridiculous. These cosmic changes shift precipitation patterns. They change regional water cycles, with or without mankind's activity. So immediately we can see that we can't make the mistake California has made of just assuming that the water cycle is going to be a fixed, stable, unchanging system. That relying on the water where it precipitates onto the ground and managing the flows provided by that precipitation is not a viable strategy into the future for mankind's water needs. We have to go to a higher level. And to really understand this, we have to go to beyond solar activity, because solar activity is not the other factor. We have to go to understand the global water cycle from the standpoint of our galaxy as a whole, the galactic system as a whole. And if we go to the next image, we can see one indication of this. This is a depiction of our understanding of the motion of our solar system through the Milky Way galaxy, through our galactic system. And our understanding of how our solar system periodically moves above and then below the plane of the galaxy, the main disk of the galactic system. And even in just one recent study, it's been shown that corresponding to this motion of our solar system through the galaxy are climate changes. That as our solar system has passed through the midplane region of the galaxy, we tend to get colder periods. When the solar system is moving either above or below the galactic plane, kind of above and below the galaxy, further away from the denser activity in the middle, we tend to get warmer periods. So this is one recent study. Other studies have shown that as our solar system moves through the spiral arms, another structure in our galaxy, as it's orbiting around the galactic center, when we move into different regions of denser activity in the galactic system, that corresponds to periods of dramatic cooling. Even some things referred to as global icehouse events, where you get glaciation that will, in some cases, cover the entire planet, and if not that far, nearly. So what does this mean? If we want to understand this water cycle that we experience, if we want to understand the climate, then we have to start at this highest level, this galactic level, which affects and controls and influences and manages the climate on Earth. Now, as soon as we say this, you're going to get some jerks out there who will complain. And they'll say, what are you talking about? Why are you even raising a 32 million year cycle, which is what this last galactic cycle was that we're looking at? Why are you saying that we should be worried about a 32 million year cycle when we have a current crisis and people are saying California is out of water in 1 year? Why are you bothering us with this, wild astrophysical stuff? And it's somewhat helpful when you hear people say that, because you can know who the idiots are and who not to listen to. This galactic perspective, this higher understanding of what our climate system is, all the factors that influence it, why it works, how it works, is the basis for the future of water on Earth under mankind's control. That despite the idiots out there, and I include the IPCC and their British associates in that category, you're living in a cosmic system right now, a galactic system. Your water cycle, which you depend upon, is an expression of a solar and galactic interaction. So this is where we have to start from. From now on, as Mr. LaRouche was saying in a discussion with him earlier today, from now on, everything which matters starts from this galactic perspective. Mankind acting from the standpoint of his developing insight into the galactic system as a whole, and then situating the solar system and situating the Earth, including its water cycle, from that standpoint. So now, what does this actually mean for the current crisis? There isn't a lack of water for California or for any part of the world. There's a lack of water management and water development. The oceans are filled with water. The atmosphere is filled with water. The sun is pumping 10 times more fresh water into the atmosphere than the amount that flows through every single river on land. So if we can pursue new ways of managing this, then this will give us an entire new handle on mankind's management of water cycles, not just relying upon the water that's already precipitated on land, but tapping into the systems of evaporation, flows of atmospheric moisture, and precipitation where that moisture in the atmosphere condenses and falls. And some of this is already being done. This is not just idle speculation. If we can see the last graphic here, what we see indicated on this map are locations where there have been successful demonstrations of the ability to increase rainfall and affect and influence atmospheric moisture flows by acting on similar factors as these cosmic or galactic factors. This is not cloud seeding, which is a form of weather modification that probably more people are familiar with, where you dump particulates into the atmosphere to help try and induce clouds to rain that are already there. These are systems that act upon the same, these are ionization systems, which affect the same electrical and ionization properties of the atmosphere, which the galactic system and these galactic effects act upon. That in effect, these types of systems pursuing this understanding of these electrical ionization properties and the cosmic inputs into the atmospheric system and the role those play in guiding and governing the water cycle and these climate systems. That this is the future of mankind's ability to influence and control the water system from a completely higher level. That this is the frontier, a greater understanding of the global system as a cosmic system driven by solar and galactic activity, but then utilizing this new insight, this new understanding which we need to develop to then improve the conditions on the planet. And this is the whole point. this is what mankind is. This is what mankind does as a creative force. And the survival of mankind now depends upon dumping people like Governor Brown and everything he represents. That mankind's survival in California, in the United States, depends upon him acting in his true nature, which is to discover new, higher order insights into what principles organize the universe, and then utilize that understanding to better improve the system in a way that only mankind can do. That we have to use this galactic perspective on climate, on the water cycle, to better figure out how to manage and improve that water cycle in a completely new way. And this has to start now. And this includes measures like nuclear desalination, the conversion of ocean water into fresh water for mankind's use using nuclear power, which is effectively the creation of completely new water cycles, powered and sustained by mankind, securing mankind's water supply and making us less vulnerable to these natural fluctuations in the water system. And to do that, to pursue nuclear desalination, means a dramatic increase in the energy flux density of the economy as a whole. But beyond this, we have to look at this immediate challenge of pursuing the control and management of these atmospheric moisture systems. You know, as referenced in the map I showed earlier and is available in more detail in my article and additional things that I have published on this subject, initial indications of our ability to control and affect and manage these atmospheric moisture flows have been demonstrated. They've been demonstrated multiple times that there is something there that we're tapping into that gives us a higher potential. So what's needed now is a crash program to better understand the climate system and the water system as a whole as a subsumed factor of this solar and galactic interaction, and determine how that understanding can be used to manage these atmospheric moisture flows, giving us a completely new flank on managing the water needs of the entire planet, California included. So anybody who's going to get in the way of that perspective, that approach, that direction of work is a threat to the future survival of mankind. Just as much as a Brown policy is a policy of death for California and any region which adopts such a similar policy. And I think just to conclude, broader point subsuming a lot of this is the greater reality that sustainability, the way most environmentalists or most brainwashed people in the United States who have been brainwashed with this idea, sustainability doesn't exist in the terms in which they think. Sustainability is not a principle of the universe. Look at the history of life. Life itself is not a sustainable process. It's been a progressive and transformative process. Developing new stages of life, developing a stage of life to its fullest extent, only to be superseded by a new higher stage. Not sustaining at any one level, not managing any one cycle at any one stage, but always moving to a qualitative shift to a higher level. That is what's natural. That's what the universe does. That's not just what life does. And that's what mankind does in a completely different and completely more powerful way. And that's what mankind's mission is. And that's what makes mankind unique. The ability to create sustainability in the process of continual creation. And that's the challenge that I think that mankind is facing now, that sustaining the human species is only achievable by constantly going to a completely new level of understanding, which we have not yet attained before. And that's the only way we can secure the continued existence and progress of mankind. And that's what we're being faced with right now with this water crisis. And facing this water crisis from a new, higher level, not trying to throw old, tired solutions at a problem that's already surpassed their viability, but going to new levels which we might not have even figured out yet, but which we know moving in that direction can open up entire new avenues for mankind.
Thank you very much, Ben. And I just want to emphasize again, Ben's paper is available both on LaRouche PAC and in the recent issue of EIR, the New Perspectives on the Western Water Crisis, Memo for the Next President. Now, Jeff Steinberg is also joining us in the studio tonight to address an additional facet of the discussion that we had with Mr. LaRouche earlier this afternoon, one which pertains to the survival of mankind. And to introduce Jeff, I'll just quickly read our institutional question for this evening, which reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, an outline agreement on the future shape of Iran's nuclear program has been reached after marathon talks with 6 major powers in Switzerland. Under the deal, Iran will reduce its uranium enrichment capacity in exchange for a phased sanctions relief. U.S. President Barack Obama said a historic understanding had been reached with Iran. The world powers and Iran now aim to draft a comprehensive nuclear accord by June 30th. The framework agreement was announced by the European Union and Iran after 8 days of negotiations in Lausanne. According to the president, the outline deal includes the following conditions. Iran will reduce its installed centrifuges used to enrich uranium by 2/3 and reduce its stockpile of low-enriched uranium. The centrifuges that are no longer in use will be placed in storage and monitored by the IAEA. All of Iran's nuclear facilities will be subject to regular IAEA inspections. Iran will redesign its heavy water reactor in Iraq so that it cannot produce weapons-grade plutonium. U.S. and EU sanctions related to Iran's nuclear program will be lifted in phases, but can be brought back if Iran does not meet its obligations. The EU foreign policy chief, speaking at the news conference alongside the Iranian foreign minister Zarif after the agreement was reached, said that a, quote, decisive step had been achieved. Our question is, will you endorse the deal if finalized? And in your opinion, what are the broader implications of this deal in the Middle East? And Jeff, why don't you deliver what Mr. LaRouche's response was to this question?
The problem is not with the deal. The problem is what President Obama has systematically refused to deal with since the day he came into office as president. He's refused to deal with the fact that the Saudis represent a grave threat to the entire situation, not only in the Middle East, but around the world. That you've got a British-Saudi apparatus that is behind the drive for war, the provocations of terrorism that have been going on. And the fact of the matter is that the President of the United States is in possession of clear evidence of the direct role of the Saudi government, the Saudi royal family. We can get down to specific names. Former Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, even the current King Salman. These people were involved in the creation of Al-Qaeda and by extension the creation of the Islamic State. There was a Saudi apparatus in place in the United States that provided indispensable logistical and financial support for the 9/11 attacks that took place in 2001. The evidence has been there since the end of 2002. Clear, unambiguous evidence about the role of high-ranking Saudi officials in carrying out the most despicable and largest-scale terrorist attack on U.S. soil in history. And yet, President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney suppressed that evidence and prevented it from being released to the public. When President Obama was campaigning for office, when he met with representatives of the 9/11 families in February of 2009 during one of his first weeks in office, when he met with those same families again in September of 2011 at the Ground Zero Memorial, he made the promise again that he would declassify the 28-page chapter from the original Joint Congressional Inquiry into 9/11 that sheds light on the entirety of the Saudi role in that attack. And he has systematically refused to do that. So now let's go back and look at the P5+1 agreement that was announced earlier this week in Lausanne, Switzerland. The Saudis are lined up adamantly against it. The Israeli government that's recently been elected, a new and even more dangerous and virulent government under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, they are adamantly opposed to the deal. So how can you legitimately make a deal knowing that you've done nothing to curb major forces that are prepared to create a war in order to stop the deal from going through? You can sign all the papers you want. You can reach all of the deals you want with the Iranians. But if you're unwilling to deal with the Saudi problem, and really we're talking about an Anglo-Saudi problem, we're talking about an alliance between the British monarchy and the Saudi monarchy that has generated every significant terrorist phenomenon that we've had to deal with over the past quarter century or longer. So if you're unwilling to take on the real tough nut, the real source of instability, the real threat of general war today, then how can you even look at something like a P5+1 agreement without coming to the conclusion that the whole thing is a setup and it's virtually an invitation to the Saudis, to their British patrons in the royal monarchy apparatus, to the Israelis, to launch the kinds of provocations that are certain to lead to minimally a full-blown regional war, and in all likelihood, because of the other aspects of President Obama's policy, particularly the provocations towards Russia, it increases the likelihood that the kind of war that will come out of this is going to be a general war and a war in which thermonuclear weapons are going to be used. And quite frankly, we're on a countdown as of Thursday of this week, April 2nd, when the deal was announced, before the applause even ended. I can assure you that in Riyadh, in certain quarters in London, in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, they're looking at June 30th as an outer limit deadline for some kind of nasty provocation to blow this agreement up. The policy of the British monarchy, the policy of the Saudi monarchy, is to conduct warfare, population warfare, within the heart of Eurasia, and to use that warfare both to destabilize and destroy the new emerging paradigm of the BRICS countries that basically threatens to completely overturn the power of the British monarchy, of Wall Street, of the Saudis, and of the entire apparatus that has basically wrecked mankind's potential for a future for the last decades. So the problem we're dealing with around what is now being celebrated as a P5+1 breakthrough is that President Obama is unwilling to take the necessary steps to actually secure a viable peace agreement. And by refusing to do that, he's creating the preconditions for a very nasty war. The British policy is to promote a 100 years conflict within the entire Islamic world, to create war between Sunnis and Shiites, starting in the Persian Gulf, Middle East region, but extending out around the entire globe. You have a situation which should be transparently clear from this standpoint. As the negotiations were going into their final days in Lausanne, Switzerland, what did the Saudis do with British and Obama backing? They launched a war inside Yemen. They began a massive population bombing campaign in Yemen under the preposterous argument that the Iranians were the secret power behind the Yemeni Houthis. So you've already got a war underway in the region. And if you put the Saudis together unchecked with Netanyahu unchecked, you've got a virtual guarantee that this region is going to go through absolute hell in a very short period of time. So we come down to something that Mr. LaRouche has been saying repeatedly, going all the way back to April of 2009. The world is not safe so long as Barack Obama remains in the office of President of the United States. And now we've got a ticking clock, and that clock runs through June 30th, which is the ostensible deadline for completing the final agreements between the P5+1 countries and Iran. By leaving the Saudis alone, by basically giving them an open key to blow things up, and you've effectively got a Saudi-Israeli partnership to destroy this arrangement underway right now. You've actually created a ticking time bomb, a clock counting down for general war. And for good measure, you also have the Obama administration escalating the direct provocations, the direct challenges against Russia through the escalation in Ukraine. You've got a situation where on April 20th, just 3 weeks from now or less, American trainers will be arriving in Ukraine to begin the process of training Ukrainian National Guard units, military training. Those National Guard units are in fact right sector and oligarchical private militias, literally Banderist neo-Nazis, who've been basically brought into the official governing structures of Ukraine. These are the Maidan terrorists who carried out the regime change operation in February of last year. These are the Nazi legions of Victoria Nuland, of the Obama State Department, who are behind another whole set of provocations directed against Russia. So you put this picture together. The Russians have made it very clear that any further NATO incursions into the countries bordering on Russia, that means Ukraine, and particularly it also means the Baltic states, where the United States is flooding those countries with forward-based military hardware and small contingents of American troops. The Russians are very clear on the fact that all of these efforts are directed at a color revolution regime change operation, not in Kiev. They've already done that. That's already been Victoria Nuland's operation. But the real target is Moscow. And in fact, if you put the map of the Persian Gulf together, the war zone that's been carved out now by the Saudis and by the Israelis, with the pretext being the June 30th deadline for the completion of the P5+1 talks, then you're talking about two critical choke point areas, areas that are intended to be block points against the vision of Eurasian integration, the world land bridge, the new Silk Road policies that have been moving forward at breakneck speed under the initiative of the Chinese, under the initiative of other members of the BRICS countries. Europe is broken from Obama. They see Obama as a lunatic for refusing adamantly to get involved in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Even the British, who have a certain sense of long life survival, were the first of the European countries to join the AIIB, the Chinese-initiated development bank that's one of a nest of new financial institutions to invest in the infrastructure across the entire Eurasian region. So Obama, the Saudis, the Israelis are not only looking for an opportunity to blow up the situation in the Middle East and block the completion of this P5+1 deal, with full green light go-ahead from Obama. They're looking to disrupt and blow up the entire heartland of Eurasia, to create a prolonged population war. Some of them are crazy enough to even think that they could attempt a limited nuclear war in the heart of Eurasia, to stop the world from going over to a whole new paradigm of development, not just cooperation among individual sovereign nation states, but an entirely new system of relations among nested groups of nation states working as single entities for policies that represent the betterment of mankind as a whole. Now, Mr. LaRouche, for many years, and I'd like to just briefly go back because I was extremely impressed by the point that Ben was making in his presentation at the start of this webcast. Mr. LaRouche has emphasized for years that the United States has gone persistently and steadily downhill since the assassination of President Kennedy. And I was very struck yesterday because in the context of Jerry Brown's announcement about banning certain water use in the state of California, it's like there's going to be police running around taking people's water bottles away or something like that. Absolutely childish, preposterous nonsense. Well, Jerry Brown's father was a governor of California during the period that overlapped the Kennedy presidency. And he launched some of the major water projects in the history of the United States, certainly in the history of California. And during that period, they knew that there was a looming future water crisis, that the actions that they had taken were useful, were productive, but insufficient. And when Kennedy was killed, as Ben emphasized, all of those ideas were dropped. Every project moving forward was dismantled. What would have been a beneficial NWAPA project 50 years ago never happened. It's impossible to conceive of simply pushing the clock back 50 years ago and trying to correct the mistakes. You're dealing with Jerry Brown as governor of California, who's a real nutcase, who was notorious as Governor Moonbeam for having all kinds of crazy ideas. His father was part of the Kennedy generation that was actually a reflection of the FDR perspective, a real Hamiltonian American system view of developing the country. And now we've got people like Jerry Brown. We've got President Obama, who is an absolute irrational fanatic, insisting that man activity, man-made events are the causes of climate change. Ben has just decimated that argument and made it clear that you're dealing with a galactic clock, not something that you can wear on your wrist and somehow or other judge local phenomena. So we're dealing with a very, very profound and deep cultural problem, which is that we've got a bunch of political leaders who know absolutely nothing, who are absolutely biased and prejudiced against science. And so these people are killing us. President Obama, by failing to act on the Saudi problem, has created the conditions where instead of looking at this P5+1 deal as something that you could say, well, we can judge it on its own merit, has created a time frame in which we can anticipate that this whole region will be blown up and can be the trigger for general war. So we've got a big problem. And if you want to solve that problem and solve it in time to actually prevent the worst immediate disaster from happening, then let's all get on the horn and make sure that this president is removed from office. We've now got a much more narrow time frame to make this happen. And if you're interested in survival, if you're interested in avoiding an eruption of a potential thermonuclear war in the period between now and the 4th of July, then you better get serious about the fact that this guy's got to go. He's committed the crimes. It's time to remove him from office. And now we've got a much more narrow window in which to carry that out.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Now, I just want to ask Ben to come back to the podium to make some concluding remarks for our broadcast here tonight.
Well, just briefly, I just wanted to bring it back to some of reflecting some of our discussion with Mr. LaRouche earlier today. I mean, I think it's important to emphasize that the invariance in this whole process, and this is something that Mr. LaRouche has been emphasizing increasingly in the context of these BRICS developments, the invariant is this need to come to a higher realization of mankind's role on this planet and beyond. And I think just coming back to this water issue in the context of how Jeff just reintroduced it, and this needs to become the pinnacle of the type of shift that Mr. LaRouche has been pointing to, this shift to the perspective of Kepler in terms of mankind's power as a force not just on Earth, but in the solar system, and as we're discussing here today, the need for mankind to be a force even beyond that on a galactic level. That this is something unique that only mankind can do. Mankind is the only species that can conceptualize this galactic system, not as an image, not as a visible object, visible concept, but as a phenomenon generated by a principle, that mankind can conceptualize and understand and discover that as a principle. And man can understand the solar system as a subsumed process of that larger system, and the Earth subsumed by that principle, and our global water system as an expression of this entire nested system. And it's mankind doing this. It's not to just try and re-simulate or redo what nature does, but this allows mankind to create new states, create new actions, types of actions, developments in the universe which would never exist without mankind's intervention. So it is, I think, just pulling this thing fully around and looking at this from the standpoint of the dramatic developments occurring with the BRICS process. You know, I think Mr. LaRouche's emphasis has been clear. This is the chance to realize in a more fundamental scientific way mankind's true role as a creative force on this level.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, Jeff. With that, we're going to bring a conclusion to tonight's broadcast. Please stay tuned to LaRouchepack.com. Thanks for joining us. Good night.